Hi, so I'm a principal support engineer here at Qlik. Well, I've worked here for the last 5 years, and the entire time my focus has been Qlik Sense. I focus, in fact, on the back end, the infrastructure of Qlik Sense. And let's get to the actual presentation. So today we're going to go through what security rules are, why you use security rules, how they work, why does the score and cache matter, and some best practices that stem from that. Let's start with what security rules are. Security rules are rules that grant access to resources in Qlik Sense. They're very customizable. They use a pretty simple logic and syntax that is pretty well documented within our help. They only grant privileges. They cannot deny them. There is no way to deny privileges in Qlik Sense. I'm probably going to mention this a few times because it is surprisingly unintuitive that you can't say no. You can merely not say yes. Then finally, they can be iterative. So you can have a rule that depends on another rule. So for example, under the default set of rules that you have, your access to an app depends on your access to a stream, and so on. So your access to the contents of an app depends on your access to that app itself. Why do you use these? Well, you use security rules, as I said, to manage resource access in Qlik Sense. You don't want to grant everyone access to everything. That's just not how organizations work. And even if your organization is that open, you still want to organize your information. You want to organize your apps. You want to be able to organize how and where you get access to things. So that's what security rules are for. They let you manage and define roles. The security rules can be built to work using roles. They can be built to work just using user and app attributes. There's a default framework that works. It comes with a bunch of different administrator roles, but you can define your own that match your business processes more precisely. They're super customizable, and when they're well constructed, they simplify your administration experience. You don't need to worry about creating new rules every time new users come online. You don't even necessarily need to worry about creating new rules every time a new business unit joins your Qlik Sense environment. You can, if you've constructed your rules well, basically rely on making maybe one or two tweaks to custom properties or to some other part of your system, and then everything should flow through from there with the appropriate privileges being granted to the appropriate people. All right, let's go through the parts of a security rule. So I'm kind of going to just skip over the identification section. I feel that those pieces are all pretty self-explanatory. So we'll start with the resource filter. This determines where the rule will be evaluated, what the rule covers, streams, apps, objects, QMC sections, etc. We will only evaluate a rule when we're trying to determine access to something that the resource filter covers. And that resource filter can go right down to an individual app object or right up to basically everything. The next part is actions. So what the rule actually grants, what you can do once you had the rule evaluate to true. So in this case, this rule gives you read access to a stream. But if you wanted to have a rule that gave you the ability to publish to a stream, then you'd grant the publish action. Now, conditions. These determine which users and objects are impacted, so which users are actually granted the rights. It's only when those conditions are met that the rule will be true. So here we're checking a custom property and we're granting that to users whose group matches that custom property. Now we have context. So this is whether or not we should evaluate this rule at all, and that's based on whether you're accessing the QMC or the hub or both. In general, most API calls will be evaluated, I believe, in the hub context, but many of the repository APIs, on the other hand, I think are QMC based. You'll probably need to check the documentation on that specific call. And then finally, there's a completely hidden attribute, one that's very easily left off, one that you cannot find if you look at the logs or the QMC it's a completely ephemeral value, and that's the score. And this score is actually deceptively simple. Whenever we use a rule and it evaluates to true, we increase the score of that rule by 1. But when the system is reset, when the service restarts, we throw away all of these values. So they're not persistent at all. They're also local, which means that if you go onto node 1 of a system and you access that, it may have a completely different set of scores than, say, node 2 in a system. And that may be because of other rules that are in play around other security rules or load balancing rules, where you have different users with different profiles going to that section. So let's go through security rules in action. What happens when, say, a user loads the hub? I'm just going to quickly go to a system. We will load the hub from there. So let's load the hub and let's have a practical example. So here is a test system where I have a bunch of different users, and we will load the hub with a user. So we'll log in as a very creatively named user1. So when user1 loads the hub, what do? We need to determine what streams. So you can see immediately these streams had to load. So we first needed to run the rules related to streams. So we were able to determine that this user has access to everyone and this user has access to test stream. This user does not have my work because they're an analyzer user, so they don't get access to that section either. That is kind of an implicit culling of rights. You cannot grant rights to an analyzer user to create applications because they're not a professional user. Now, we've got access to the test stream. We also need to know what apps are published in that stream. So in this case, we not only call a request to see what streams user 1 has access to, but we also run a separate query to check what apps they have access to. It used to be that we would run this check, we'd just make a call against apps, and so implicitly we'll be checking every single app that they have read access to, and this is what used to allow you to share unpublished apps with other users if you had your rules set correctly. Now, unfortunately, that runs into scaling problems, and once you start having thousands of applications, that call became very slow, and you would see the hub load times creep into 40 seconds, a minute, sometimes even longer. So now we pre-filter that. So rather than checking the read access rights on every single application, we check the read access rights on published applications and applications that user owns, which is a much smaller list in any system I've ever come across. Now, if we will log in as user 2, and we do the exact same thing, we're going to have a slightly different list, but it will largely be the same process. User 2. So again, we've had to pull in what streams they have access to. This user has a professional license, so they can create applications. They get access to work. And then we also have access to streams. And we can see those streams are in place, the apps are in place, and we had to load those as well. So let's go back to the diagram that we had up before. All right, so when a user loads the hub, what's happening? So first we need the user context. So we're loading the hub, it's the hub context. We need the resources, we're loading apps and streams. So those are the things that are being passed through to the repository. The repository knows it's dealing with the user, it's dealing with the hub, it's dealing with apps and streams. It uses that to filter all of the relevant security rules down to just that context. Apps, streams, hub, user 1 and or user 2. It then will evaluate the rules. It will go through and it will look at rules regarding streams, and it will look at the highest scoring rule regarding streams, and it will evaluate that for read privileges. And then once it's done that, it does the same thing with applications. It's just that the list of applications is slightly restricted. And finally, when it's finished the rule evaluation, it will cache these results and it will increase the score of any rules that turned out to be useful. These results are cached, and the next time that user goes to the hub, we don't need to do any of the rule evaluation or checking relevant security rules. We just check the cache, find the result, and return true, false, whatever the app's results are. That's what happens when you load the hub. A similar thing will happen when you load the QMC. When you load an app, we also need to check these rules. And so let's go into the cache a bit more. So why do we cache things? We cache things to speed things up. We sacrifice a bit of memory consumption to make it so that our security queries run faster. However, you can't cache everything. You can't cache things all the time because other things will change and you may no longer have the results. We can't proactively cache everything because in a big system, there's just not enough time and potentially not enough memory to do so. So we have to occasionally throw out results. We throw out results when rules change. If you change a rule, well, potentially, because rules are able to be iterative, that means that absolutely everything could have changed. You could have disabled a rule that granted access to all of your streams, and suddenly no one has access to streams, no one has access to apps. Well, that's pretty catastrophic, and users and administrators probably shouldn't be doing that, but we need to reevaluate all of the rules. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. Then there are smaller scale invalidations. So for example, if you have new user attributes show up, well, that user's attributes have changed. The rule evaluations for that user need to be redone, so we throw out the old ones. And similarly, if you make a change to an application or you make a change to a stream, then we also will throw out all of the results for that individual item so that if a user needs to check if they have access against it, we have to evaluate the rules for that individual item because, again, maybe it no longer is, the previous result is no longer true. So we throw out the results. So why do these things matter, right? Both of these things mean that we have the system kind of optimize its own usage over time, try and speed things up over time. That score system means that if you've got a broad rule, it's probably being checked very often, which means it's going to have a high score, which means you want a simple, fast, broad rule. You want to save niche results for niche rules. So you make broad rules and then you make specific rules. And you want your specific rules can be complex. You want to ideally make your broad rules as simple and as fast as possible. Iterative rules are one way of making things simpler, but they require multi-step rule evaluation. They kind of hide their complexity. And that means that iterative rules, while they're simpler and a little bit easier to manage, they tend to cost more when it comes to performance. And the security rules cache means your system is slowest just after a restart, because the other time, the cache, like the score, it's ephemeral. We throw it out whenever the system restarts. It's never written to disk. It's never written to the database. It's gone. So your system will be slowest just after a restart. Nothing's cached, and the rule evaluation may not be optimal for the environment that it's running in. So you need to be aware that your system is slower after you restart it. And the other thing is that cache invalidation means that when you make rule changes, you also will slow your system down, almost as much as if you just restarted it. So you want to try and make those rule changes in kind of as dense a period as possible, because if you make rule changes once a day, the system will slow down once a day. If you make your rule changes, every 3 hours or so, your system will slow down every 3 hours. So try and batch those changes. Try and make all of your changes at one period in the day, just before a maintenance window, ideally. And then let's go through some security best practices, and then I'm going to go through a couple of rules that I think are quite interesting, one of which I think is pretty elegant, and the other of which is, simple, not an ideal rule to build your system around. So firstly, security models should be based around what you want users to be able to do. You should be working through, have a spreadsheet, have roles defined, and say, okay, A developer is a user that can make apps, and they should have streams that they can access and they can publish these in-process apps to for vetting, but it's these users can do these things. Do not work backwards from a analyzer is a user that can't do anything but look at apps, right? Because that's just, it doesn't work with our security model, and it's much easier to maintain and build rules based around giving people access to things than trying to work with the system that can't take access away, but be thinking in terms of what people can't do. You want to use broad, simple rules where possible. Complicated rules should be restricted to edge cases. Broad, simple, fast rules where possible. You want to centralize and batch rule changes. Try and restrict structural changes to maintenance windows. You want to use either roles or security groups to manage your system. Avoid hard-coding rules around usernames. This isn't because they are slow. This is because that is not very maintainable, and those rules won't evaluate true very often either, so they're not going to speed things up for most users. It's just, it results in your security model being a bit of a mess, so don't do it. And ideally, review your rules periodically. When it comes to a system where you are occasionally making rules for covering specific edge cases, maybe you can hopefully consolidate those into more general rules, to role-based rules or something. If you have made some around hard-coded usernames, periodically review your rules, work out if there are any that can be removed, work out if there are some that can be consolidated. And let's take a look at those security rules I mentioned. So this user has access to test stream 2. Previous user had access to test stream 1. It's the exact same rule that determined access to that. We'll log in as an administrator here, and we'll take a look at the security rules. So there's two rules I want to highlight here. So one rule requires a little bit of preparation to set up, but it allows you to manage your streams in a very centralized way. So you can see there are these stream rules that kind of come with the system. They determine access to everyone and to monitoring apps, and they're all built using the default thing. So you got, when you create a stream, it prompts you to create an access rule for that individual stream, and then you end up with a whole lot of rules to govern this one set of resources. So instead, if we go up to here and we look at this generic stream read access rule, this rule grants any user who has a group that matches the stream group read custom property. So we can then go to our streams over here. Now if we look at stream 1 and we look at custom properties, it's got test group 1 in it, in this stream group read. So anyone who's a member of test group 1 gets read access to that stream. And similarly, if we go to test stream 2, you can see that test group 2 is in both the read and the write custom properties to give those users access to that. So we've got one rule that gets evaluated very often because it's evaluated for every given stream, and it's fairly simple. And when I need to add a new group and I need to determine what groups have access to the stream, I can just have someone go through and add the custom property for that. It is worth noting that if you add a new value to a custom property, so if we go down to custom properties here, and if we were to take one of these and add a new potential value, so test group 3 for example, then that will actually invalidate our entire cache, just like if we changed a rule. But it still makes it for a much more maintainable rule. And then let's take a look at the access to tasks. Tasks is a deceptively expensive area to grant people access to. So one rule that I've seen, especially if you want, say, a developer to be able to manage tasks around their own applications, is a fairly simple generic access. So something like this. So this grants someone access to tasks related to apps they have read access to. So this is broad, it's simple, both of those things are good, but unfortunately it's also exceedingly expensive So if we log in as user 2, and unfortunately this is one of those things where it looks fine. It looks fine when you're just setting up the system and you have a couple of dozen applications, because you don't run into scaling problems at that level. But if I log into the QMC as user 2, user 2 has a separate rule that grants them access to the tasks interface. And so let's say that user 2 is meant to be able to manage their tasks, so they've been granted access to this. So that generic task rule, they've got read access to this task. They can then go through and they can modify this. They can create new triggers, they can adjust existing triggers, they can initiate the task. They can't create a new task, they can't delete an existing task. Very helpful way of letting your developers initiate reloads without necessarily having to open, even on a published app, without having to open it up and without needing to grant them stream access rights. However, the problem comes with this has privilege. Has privilege is quite slow. What happens here is whenever we try and determine what task someone has access to, we first need to then go through and run our read rules for apps that that user has access to. So we go through every single task in the system and then we check the read privileges on the app. It kicks off a completely separate instance of the rules engine to do this, and it's just a very slow operation. If I had a couple of thousand apps and a few hundred tasks for those apps, this interface, rather than loading immediately, would load in a minute or two, possibly longer. And it's just a really bad user experience, and it's a really expensive operation on the system, because it's not even that it's a bad user experience because the repository is slow. It's a bad user experience because the repository is very busy trying to evaluate these rules. And so you end up with a system which is very busy showing the user nothing. And so it slows everything down for everyone else as well. There are various efforts to try and speed things up in this interface that are still kind of ongoing. In general, you want to grant users, if you do want your developers to have access to tasks in the QMC, you should be granting them access to the apps interface and having them go via the apps interface, so it's only evaluating small numbers of tasks rather than through here. I mean, the equivalent is if you went here and you double clicked on this and went to the associated items. That's a much faster interaction. It gets the developer through the interface much faster, even though it's more clicks, and it's a much lower stress on the system. All right, let's go and take a look at some resources if you want to learn more. There are a number of different places you can go if you want to get more information on security rules. So I have a number up here. So there is this blog post that I wrote, which is also going into security rules in Qlik Sense and the performance thereof. This is where we published information about the cache and about the score system. When you're constructing rules, you can find out more information on our help site. So you can see information on the various functions that you can use. You can see information on the different resource conditions and filters that you can use. And you can even see some old posts about security rules and the management and building thereof. So these links will be available along with the recording of the presentation. And now I think it's time to go through some Q&A.
Okay, great. Everyone, now it's time for Q&A. Andrew, which question would you like to address first?
All right, great. Thank you, Troy. So going through some of the questions here, I can see a few about the cache. One of them is, when is the cache thrown out when we create new values in custom properties, new streams, etc., not just change them? And that's correct. Actually, from the perspective of the rules engine, if you add a new custom property value, and I suspect also if you remove one, then we treat that as if you've changed a rule. So we actually throw out the entire security cache when you do that. So it can, adding a new potential value is a fairly expensive operation. I can also see someone who's asking a question about where can I find the resource filters. So let me just get my screen shared properly here. And that is, but the answer there is our help. There is a page in our help which actually talks and goes through all of the resource filters that are available to security rules. So that will help you see that. As I mentioned in the presentation, you cannot see the security rule score. It's an entirely ephemeral value. Unfortunately, that means that at the moment, at least, there is literally no way to see that. I can also see someone just asked, what happens if we delete the root admin security rule? The short answer is you can't. So there are a few rules that are treated as kind of immutable. So one of them is the root admin rule. So if I just go here and I search for this rule, you can actually see I cannot delete this rule. It immediately grays out. It would be possible to delete this rule by going to the database. I have to stress that's not supported. If you do that, we will probably tell you to restore from backup because we can't really fix that system. All right. So then let's take another look. Sorry, there's quite a few rules coming. Quite a few questions coming in, which is great. But I need to look through these. Is there an API to evaluate security rules for use in custom extensions? I'm not familiar with one. I know that you can, for example, run through the audit interface via the APIs, but I don't think that's really what you're asking for here. And when I talk about that, I'm meaning this can also be run via the API. The audit function is generally quite slow, but for the root admin, because it's basically yes for absolutely everything, this rule is quite fast. Oh, right. I should note, actually, when I've been talking about security rules, there are also load balancing rules and license rules, and those are effectively the same under the hood. They're kind of treated the same way. They just have slightly different contexts. Now, is it possible to get a verbose log of the evaluation of security rules? Fortunately, no, there is not. How would you manage the security for organizations with more than 1,000 users? So while I personally have not managed an organization on that scale, I've dealt with plenty of cases where customers have. Generally speaking, they are using Active Directory groups, and so they're using rules based around group membership. So you would build your rules around specific group memberships, and you would have a set of Active Directory groups for Qlik Sense. And that's how a lot of organizations do that. If you're not going to be using Active Directory or groups that you can easily pull in, then creating roles is the other way to do that. And the way you create a role, well, there's kind of two ways. One, you can go to your users and you can modify their role string. It should be oh wait, I should probably do this with a regular user. Should be able to do that from here. Can't remember. The other way to do it, however, is add role. So this will populate automatically with any role mentioned in one of your security rules. But the other way to do it is to, write your role here. So let's say this is a designer. So then you have a role there. This user is tagged with designer, and then you can use that role in your security rules that way. So what would be the best way to give developers access to the tasks section? So this is kind of a work in progress, so to speak, for Qlik. Right now, if you're a small organization access to tasks isn't too bad, but it's really once you start getting into the larger organizations that you can start to run into problems. The QMC is a centralized piece of technology. It always runs on the central node, and the tasks interface in versions of Qlik Sense that are currently available um, doesn't actually get cached. So unlike the app section, which if I go here and I were to refresh the page or go back to it, it would be using results from the security cache. For some reason right now, the tasks interface does not benefit from it, so it's always slow. That is being fixed, but it means that the tasks section is also always kind of expensive. Ideally, like I said, what you do is you would grant them access to tasks by having them go through the app section. I realize it's a bit more cumbersome, but this is, in the systems where I've seen scaling problems, this is genuinely like 20 times faster than going through the task section and doesn't result in huge performance costs. I can see there was a question here that was kind of related. Sorry, just need to quickly look for that again. Yes, I've seen two people mention, sometimes I've noticed that rules seem to take a while to go into effect on RIM nodes. And that is actually related to the cache. And it's something that we are still kind of trying. It's in some systems, the notifications between the central node and the RIM nodes don't always seem to go through. And we are still trying to work out why. It's unfortunately both very difficult for us to reproduce that issue and very uncommon. So it still happens. And yeah, what will happen there is if you make a rule change, the RIM node won't pick up on it. It'll continue to use the cached versions of the rules, and it won't go to look for a new version. And you kind of have to restart the RIM node to get it to pick up on it. That shouldn't happen. It's not meant to. If you are seeing that, then open a support case about it so we can try and help you with that. Okay, so I can see there was someone that was asking about how do they stop having all of their professional users have access to all apps in my work. So that is a sign of two things. One, that you're using a relatively old version of QlikSense, because newer versions of QlikSense pre-filter the list and they shouldn't be able to see apps they don't own in my work. But the other one is that indicates there is a rule somewhere that gives professional users access to all apps. And so you're going to need to go through and look at your rules interface and basically try and identify which rule is granting access to all apps for an individual user. So it unfortunately is kind of a pain. You do need to go to the rules section and go through each rule and check its audit functionality. We don't have the ability to move backwards from the audit interface into which rules are granting each individual piece. But that's broadly what it is, because if you have access to an application but not access to the stream, then generally speaking, it will show up in your My Work. Okay, I think that is all we have time to answer now. But like Troy mentioned earlier, we will answer other questions in the community. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you to Andrew for presenting. We always appreciate getting experts like Andrew to share with us. Here's our legal disclaimer. And thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.